Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. Years after the suspicious deaths occurred at the very hospital where I spent time as a baby, I decided to investigate what happened. Had this been a mass murder or a tragic coincidence? When our expert copy editor, Rob, sent back this piece after he had finished working on it, he wrote, "Boy, that certainly did not disappoint. And that's exactly how I feel, too." Lee spent countless hours researching, reporting, writing and shaping this exhaustive story about a chilling mystery she felt a personal connection to, and it comes through in every sentence. This piece, the last in our series collab with creative nonfiction, Heart of the Matter, will have you at the edge of your seat, and then surprise you when you least expect it. Enjoy and please share. Jesse Sposato, Executive Editor. Kevin Garnett was furious. He shouted and banged his fist against a wall inside Toronto's hospital for sick children, demanding to know why his son had died. The boy, Kevin Paxi, had been born just 25 days earlier with a head of dark hair like his 21-year-old father. His mother, Lori Paxi, also 21, thought her son was perfect. But Kevin's heart had started to fail in his second week of life, and he had barely survived an episode of shock. His heart was structurally normal, but its conduction system seemed to be misfiring. Earlier that day, March 11, 1981, he had been transferred to the world-renowned hospital, known as Sick Kids. Youngsters came from all over the globe to the imposing brick building, where doctors had invented techniques that revolutionized pediatric heart surgery. Cardiologists were venerated. They seemed to work miracles to prolong the lives of children born with faulty hearts. The previous spring, the hospital had unveiled a splashy renovation of its cardiac unit, which now stretched over wards 4A and 4B. But since the summer, deaths on the cardiac unit had soared 625% higher during the 9-month period between July 1980 and March 1981 than in the periods before and after, according to a later government analysis. Most of the deaths had happened overnight, when one of the 8 nursing teams, headed by Phyllis Traynor, was on duty. By the fall of 1980, the 5 nurses had earned a nickname, the Jinx Team. The cardiologists at the hospital had formally discussed the surge in deaths in the fall, around the time the nickname had surfaced, as well as a few months later in January. But they attributed the children's deaths to their cardiac conditions and thought that the increase might be a natural cluster. You have some in which you say, this child was expected to die. They were seriously ill or they wouldn't be in the cardiac unit, a hospital administrator told the Toronto Star in a May 1982 article. Kevin, though, didn't seem to fit in that category. Doctors had told his mother, Lori, to go home and get some rest. Her son was out of harm's way. He likely had a condition that would respond to treatment. Overnight, 2 doctors examined the baby and found his heart rate stable. They told the nurse who was looking after him, 24-year-old Susan Nels, that they saw little cause for immediate concern. But by around 4 a.m., Kevin's condition had changed. His heart was oscillating back and forth between slow and fast beats. He was lethargic, his breathing shallow, his extremities blue. Dr. Colm Costigan, the hospital's chief pediatric resident, checked the boy's heart rate. It was slow. The doctor suspected Kevin might be suffering from an overdose of digoxin, a medication used to treat congestive heart failure. Digoxin, a derivative of the foxglove plant, has been used for centuries to help the heart pump. Babies' doses are tiny, measured in millionths of a gram. The line between a therapeutic dose and a toxic dose is narrow, making the risk of an overdose high, though not fatal in every case. Digoxin toxicity can manifest as an irregular or slow heart rate, vomiting, cardiac arrest and seizures, among other symptoms, all of which can also indicate unrelated cardiac issues. Sick kids tested patients who were getting digoxin. If their blood showed a reading of 3.5 nanograms per milliliter, ng/ml, or more, doctors would put the medication on hold. Dr. Costigan transferred Kevin to the intensive care unit and put a hold on his digoxin. For an hour, the baby's heart rate returned to normal. By then the sun was up. At around 8:45 a.m., Kevin stopped breathing. The lower chambers of his heart started to contract rapidly, out of sync. Over and over again, Dr. Costigan and the arrest team tried to resuscitate the infant, but it didn't work. At around 10 a.m. on March 12, 1981, Kevin was pronounced dead. After the outburst from the boy's father, Dr. Rodney Fowler, a senior cardiologist, called a coroner and asked him to investigate Kevin's death. "Maybe it will give the father some relief," he said, according to the coroner's 2021 memoir. Like Dr. Fowler, Dr. Costigan, who was the head of the cardiac arrest team, was also preoccupied with the death. The effort to revive the boy reminded him of the death of 20-day-old Jordan Hines a few days earlier. As with Kevin Paxi, no matter what they did, no matter what medications they gave him, Jordan's heart continued to spasm. The two deaths were similar, so Dr. Costigan was surprised to learn later that Jordan hadn't been prescribed digoxin. For Kevin, Dr. Costigan requested a digoxin test on a blood sample taken before the infant died. The results came back 5 days later, more than 10 ng/ml, 2 to 3 times higher than a potentially toxic dose and the highest number Dr. Costigan had ever seen. A post-mortem blood sample showed an even higher number. He was convinced that digoxin had killed Kevin. Justin Cook was an early Christmas gift for his parents, Jackie, 19, and Brad, 20. The couple had been living in Western Canada, but when Jackie got pregnant, they moved to Tara, a small town a few hours northwest of Toronto, where Brad worked on his parents' 300-acre farm. From the start, Justin did nothing but eat and only cried when he was hungry. One day in March of 1981, when the boy was about 3 months old, he turned blue, a sign that his heart wasn't getting enough oxygen to his body. His parents bundled him into the car and drove southeast to Sick Kids, the baby watching the country slide by out the window. When they arrived, a petite, 5-foot-tall nurse with a blonde bob greeted them. It was Susan Nels. Just over a week had passed since Kevin Paxi's death. That night, Nels had been looking after a nearly year-old girl named Alana Miller, who had a complicated series of heart defects and multiple spleens. But Justin's admission was urgent, and Nels accompanied him to get an ultrasound of his heart. Tests subsequently revealed that he had a constellation of complex cardiac abnormalities, and the hospital scheduled him for emergency surgery. The next night, March 21, 1981, Nels was assigned to look after Justin one-on-one, a practice reserved for the sickest babies. His mother, Jackie, later recalled to a reporter how Nels had held Justin in her arms, sat beside his bed and rocked him, just as if she were his mother. "We felt he couldn't be safer," Jackie said. Meanwhile, as Nels had been occupied with Justin, Alana had gone into cardiac arrest and died. Sick Kids doctors met with hospital administrators, coroners, and 2 police officers who were assisting the coroners with fact-finding. The doctors thought they had the situation under control, but the cops floated another possibility: murder. Alana's digoxin test came back at 8 p.m. that same evening. The results were more than 70 ng/ml. Off the charts. The number echoed the reading of another infant who had died in the cardiac unit in January. Born with multiple complex heart defects, Janice Estrella had struggled for most of her short life. At 4 months, she was still the size of a newborn, and her mother considered her death inevitable, according to a 1981 news report. Janice's digoxin readings were high when she was alive, and after she died a pathologist tested her levels, likely the first time sick kids had analyzed a post-mortem sample for digoxin. At the time, the result of 72 ng/ml was so high that it looked like a mistake, as if a decimal were missing or the sample contaminated. Now it didn't seem like a mistake. The doctors met again and decided to act. They made digoxin a controlled drug, meaning it would no longer be available on open shelves but instead locked in the narcotics cabinet. Only a head nurse or team leader could dispense it. In the early hours of March 22, Dr. Costigan and a colleague visited the wards to disseminate the new protocols. It would be too late for Justin Cook. At around 3:45 a.m., the baby turned bluer. He had a seizure. His heart rate slowed and the organ contracted wildly, a scene achingly similar to Kevin's and Alana's final hours. Justin was pronounced dead at around 5 a.m. A couple of hours later, the boy's father, Brad, came to the ward and implored Nels that he be allowed to see his son. She took him to the morgue and, with tears in her eyes, told him how sorry she was that Justin had died. The hospital got back the results of Justin's digoxin test later that day. The sample, taken before the baby died, showed a reading of 72 ng/ml. Justin had never been prescribed digoxin. This was now a murder investigation. Staff SGT. Jack Press, a balding veteran of Toronto's homicide squad, and SGT. Anthony Warr, who had just joined the squad, set up shop at Sick Kids. They took off their ties, put on white medical coats the better to blend in poured over the unit's medical and staff records, and interviewed Sick Kids staff. The cops quickly pieced together what some on the wards already knew: the same nursing team had been on shift when all of the babies known to have high digoxin readings, Janice, Kevin, Alana, and Justin, had died. No doctor had been consistently on duty during any of the patients' deaths, going back to January. And only one nurse had been assigned to care for Justin Cook one-on-one, Susan Nels. She had also given Kevin Paxi his last dose of digoxin. And Dr. Fowler told the cops that she'd had a strange look on her face as she was writing up Justin's death report. No signs of grief. Prosecutors agreed that the cops had grounds to arrest Nels for Justin's alleged murder. The nurse and her colleagues on the Jinx team had been sent home after he had died, but they were scheduled to return for their shift that night. Other patients were at risk. The cops wanted to act. Nels lived on a quiet street not far from the hospital, in a brick duplex where she shared an apartment with her roommates. Working in the medical field was in Nels's DNA. Her father was the head of pediatrics at the hospital in Belleville, the small Ontario city where she'd grown up. In the 1950s, he had done his early training at Sick Kids. Nels's older brother, David, was then a resident at Sick Kids. A year after finishing nursing school, she started working there herself, and in June 1980, she got a position in the cardiac unit, her dream job. Given the inquest into Kevin Paxi's death, prompted by the boy's father, Nels assumed the police would talk to her. One of her roommates, a law student named Allison Woodbury, advised her to get a lawyer and connected Nels with her brother, who phoned with a couple of names. Nels wrote down the names and slipped the paper into the pocket of her robe. Not long after, at around noon on March 25, two men were at her door. "Are you Susan Nels?" the older one asked. "Yes," she replied. Sergeants Press and Warr asked to come in. Nels led them down a long hallway, and the three took seats at the kitchen table. Here were these two big burly police officers and little me, Nels recalled in 2015. All I can remember at the time was feeling alone and so vulnerable. Press explained that Nels didn't have to talk the standard caution that police officers give. Justin Cook died of an overdose of digoxin, a drug he wasn't supposed to have, he continued. "We believe you gave him the drug, and we'd like to know why. Do you wish to give any explanation for his being given digoxin?" Nels remembered her roommate's advice. "I think I want to speak to a lawyer," she responded. Press asked her if she had a particular name, and she pulled the piece of paper from the pocket of her robe. He said she could make the phone call from the police station. Why the police station? Nels asked. Because I am arresting you on a charge of murder, Press replied. That night, the Toronto News was consumed with the story of the nurse who'd allegedly killed one of her infant patients at the illustrious Sick Kids, no less. The Toronto Star chartered a private plane for a reporter and photographer to score the first interview with the Cooks, who were back in terror mourning their loss. They had buried Justin on March 23, believing he'd died of natural causes. When they phoned to tell us he was gone, they said he took a blue spell and didn't come out of it and that his system had just quit, Brad Cook told the Toronto Star reporter. Now, on March 25, they heard the news on the radio. Their baby was the victim in a murder investigation. At the precinct, Nels was afraid to respond to any question where she wasn't sure of the answer but equally afraid to stay silent. In a police interview, she mostly responded, "I don't wish to answer that at this time." Her selective responses only confirmed the cops' suspicion of her guilt. Nels was reportedly transferred to a 9 by 7 foot cell in a detention center with a bunk, desk, chair, open toilet, and sink. She was held in segregation. Her fellow inmates might not take kindly to an alleged baby killer. Nels's parents, James and Barbara, raced to Toronto to see their daughter. "We sat in a holding room appropriately named because we sat and held each other and simply cried," Nels recalled in 2015. The nurse was initially charged with Justin Cook's death, and murder charges related to Janice Estrella, Kevin Paxi, and Alana Miller came a couple of days later. That's when Janice's parents, Alana's mom, and Kevin's parents learned that their children might not have died of natural causes. After 5 days, Nels was released on bail of $50,000 Canadian, around $170,000 Canadian in today's dollars, or about $121,000 US. Nels's defense team was immediately convinced of her innocence. She was clear-eyed, reserved, polite, considerate, and above all, apparently quite sane, eminent defense attorney Austin Cooper recalled in a 2005 article about his first meeting with his client. The junior lawyer on the case, Mark Sandler, was tasked with reading the prosecution's 4-volume brief of evidence against Nels. When he was done, he ran into Cooper's office. "There is just no credible case against her whatsoever," Sandler exclaimed, a presumptuous move for someone barely a year into his law career. "I don't understand how they think they can sustain a case." The prosecution's theory was that a single killer had committed the murders. No evidence of a conspiracy between any of the nurses had surfaced, and that Nels had had the exclusive opportunity to kill Justin, as well as opportunities to kill the others. After consulting with a Chicago-based digoxin expert, they determined the fatal dose would likely have been administered intravenously within 15 minutes of the onset of the infant's critical symptoms. But Nels had worked the day shift on the night Janice died. She had left the hospital hours before the baby's death. The cops initially theorized that problems with Janice's 4 might have caused the digoxin to hit her system more slowly, though they later abandoned that line of thinking. And Nels hadn't actually been the only one to care for Justin. Sometime between 1:45 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., Phyllis Traynor, the team leader, had relieved Nels while she took a break. Nels returned to Justin's bedside no later than 3:30 a.m., and the infant's critical symptoms started at around 3:45 a.m. While the wards that made up the cardiac unit, wards 4A and 4B, each had their own nursing teams, nurses routinely covered one another's shifts and helped out across the unit while they were on duty. Still, the defense had a high bar to clear. First, Nels would face a preliminary inquiry, a legal proceeding to determine whether there was enough evidence to go to trial. At this stage, prosecutors didn't need to prove Nels was guilty, only that there was enough evidence to advance the case. The preliminary inquiry got underway in January 1982, in what Linda Furst, then a law student working with the defense team, described as a stuffy courtroom with high ceilings and wood paneling. Every morning, Nels and her legal team would elbow through a media scrum, Furst told me. Rows of spectators, reporters, and police officers filled the room. Nels's friends organized a calendar to ensure that at least one of them attended the inquiry with her every day. As nurses, doctors, cops and experts submitted to the lawyer's questioning, Nels remained stoic. Her ability to keep her chin up and to be optimistic about what the outcome would be in the face of huge press scrutiny, the weight of the law being brought down upon her, it was just incredible, Furst told me. The prosecution's investigation didn't stop after Nels was arrested. They eventually examined records going back to the summer of 1980, 9 months before Justin Cook had died, and found a number of carbon copy deaths that were also potential digoxin poisonings. One of these infants was Stephanie Lombardo, who had died just before Christmas at 10 days old, 6 days after heart surgery. Sick Kids, a teaching hospital, routinely autopsied patients who died, but Stephanie's parents had declined. In February 1982, they agreed to have her body exhumed. At least 8 more babies were exhumed as part of the investigation. Tests on Stephanie Lombardo's tissues showed extremely high digoxin levels, but she'd never been prescribed the drug. More important for Nels's defense, the nurse had been on vacation for days before the girl's death. The prosecution's case was unraveling. Throughout the proceedings, Nels's lawyers had advanced a theory that it was actually Phyllis Traynor who was responsible for the alleged murders. Traynor had been on duty for all of the most suspicious deaths. In September, a 3-week respite in suspicious deaths coincided with her honeymoon. And Traynor had been helping Nels care for Alana Miller and Justin Cook before they died. Traynor denied killing the babies. Lead prosecutor Robert McGee later testified that throughout the preliminary inquiry he continued to think that Nels was the culprit in Justin Cook's death, as well as the most likely killer of Kevin Paxi and Alana Miller. And he believed he could get a conviction in Justin's case. On May 21, 1982, Nels was in the courtroom with her parents and brother. She wore a high-necked blouse with puff sleeves and a skirt with flowers along the bottom. During the 10-week proceeding, she had watched 122 witnesses testify. Judge David Van Eck was ready to decide whether she would go free or go to trial. He found that a toxic dose of digoxin, administered deliberately, had indeed killed the 4 babies she was charged with murdering, and that the evidence pointed to a single killer. But it wasn't Nels. No direct evidence implicated her, he found. All of her actions are perfectly consistent with the due and proper performance of her regular duties as a registered nurse, he wrote. Moreover, the evidence of the so-called carbon copy deaths appears to point in an entirely different direction. Nels left the courtroom surrounded by her lawyers, as people on all sides shouted questions. It was like pandemonium hit when he delivered his judgment, and we were swarmed, Sandler told me. I knew my innocence. My friends and family knew my innocence, and now I just know the rest of the world knows my innocence, Nels told a reporter soon after. Nels, her family, and her defense team went out for a celebratory dinner. Her father didn't look well though. You could see just the toll that it had taken on the family, Sandler told me. A few months later, Nels's father died of a heart attack. By early 1983, the police had exhausted their leads, and the investigation was over, according to Death Shift, The Digoxin Murders at Sick Kids, a 1984 book written by the late CBC reporter Ted Bisland. No direct evidence of Traynor's involvement ever surfaced, and she was never charged. Much of the public felt that bedrock institution's Sick Kids, the police, prosecutors, the media had failed Canadians. Kevin Cox, then a 30-something reporter at Toronto's Globe and Mail, hungry for information about the biggest story of the day, gave his number out to the parents and told them to call him anytime. People did call me late at night, 10, 11 o'clock, and in tears, totally upset with the system that wasn't giving them any answers. Was it a cover-up? Was there a murderer still loose in that hospital? Cox told me. We had no answers. The public wanted accountability. The Ontario government responded by launching a commission to investigate how the babies died and the circumstances surrounding the charges against Nels. At its head was Justice Samuel Grange, a respected 64-year-old judge with thick white streaks in his hair and a sprinkle of liver spots across his forehead. Grange allowed cameras to film the proceedings, and front pages and nightly newscasts across Canada were filled with scenes from the courtroom. Bisland filed a story almost every day, and when he didn't, people would call to ask why. In April 1984, roughly 2 years after she had cleared her name, Nels was back in a courtroom, taking the stand for the first time. A week into her testimony, a Toronto cable company started broadcasting each day's session live, making Canadian television history. Toronto residents were glued to their TVs. "I hate to say it," Cox said, "but it was like a daytime soap opera." One of those Toronto residents consuming the coverage. My mom. For months, the Globe arrived on my parents' downtown doorstep, filled with stories of infants with critical heart issues, killed in the very place meant to sustain their lives, their apparent murders unsolved. When my mom, then 30, gave birth to me that May, the courtroom proceedings were far from her mind. In her hospital room, all was bliss. Her first child was a healthy baby girl. But as I lay in the nursery, something caught a nurse's eye, my lips had a blue tinge. The familiar loop-dub of my heartbeat was swallowed by a murmur, the last beat a vibrating trill. Something was wrong, a cardiologist told my parents. They needed to send me to sick kids. Suddenly, all those babies dying turned from newsprint to real life. We were part of that story, my mom recalled thinking. I was taken by ambulance to sick kids, where my parents met me. My mom remembers seeing a sign pointing the way to Ward 4A. My God, this is the floor where those babies died, she thought. Is something going to happen to her? My room had 4 cribs and a big window overlooking the street. Had the babies died in this room? In that bed? My mom yearned to ask the nurses, but she worried that saying the wrong thing might disrupt my care. I thought if I had answers to those questions, I could protect my baby better, she told me recently. But I was totally too afraid to ask because, what if it was in the same room? Compared with the other babies on the ward, I looked healthy, pudgy and pink, though I got dusky when I cried, but the staff was watching me for heart failure. To ease the work that my heart had to do, they planned to put me on digoxin. To my mom, the word meant poison. She didn't exactly think a murderer was stalking the wards. No suspicious deaths had occurred in the 3 years since Justin Cook had died. The more my mom interacted with the nurses, and the more she observed their kindness and skill, the harder it was for her to believe that Nels, someone just like these nurses, had killed her patients. But the deaths had shaken my mom's faith, underscoring the uncertainty, the potential for deadly mistakes, the fine line between safety and collapse. I underwent different tests, and the diagnosis was confirmed: tricuspid atresia, ventricular septal defect, atrial septal defect, a clunk of syllables like ice cubes clattering in a glass. An accident of cardiac muscle and its absence had given me a rare kind of heart, one valve skinned over, one chamber never formed, 2 holes where there should be none. In other words, my tricuspid valve was closed up. One of the pumping chambers, or ventricles, wasn't developed. And there were 2 holes, one between the upper 2 chambers and another between the lower 2 chambers. Altogether, it meant that my heart wasn't able to get enough oxygen to my body. I would have 2 stopgap operations, one at 9 months and another at 2 years old, to keep me going until I grew big enough for the final procedure, an open heart surgery known as a Fontan. The surgical technique had been in use for a little more than a decade at that point, and my pediatric cardiologist had no data to show my parents about long-term survival rates. It didn't matter. It was the only option the doctors had. By the time the Grange hearings concluded in September 1984, they had generated 44,000 pages of transcripts, so much material that the judge hired 2 people to manage the evidence on a computer. There is a great future for the computer in these kinds of proceedings, Grange wrote in his 300-page report, completed that December. Ultimately, Grange examined 36 deaths that took place on the sick kids' cardiac wards between June 30, 1980 and March 22, 1981, including 33 babies and infants, 1 child, and 2 teenagers. He concluded that 8, including Janice Estrella, Kevin Paxi, Alana Miller, Justin Cook, Jordan Hines, and Stephanie Lombardo, were murdered with a deliberate overdose of digoxin. 15 had died in circumstances where a digoxin overdose was suspected or highly suspected, 6 died of natural causes, and 7 weren't possible to categorize, he found. Grange ruled out the possibility that medication errors, digoxin accidentally administered to the wrong patients, in the wrong doses or in place of another drug, were to blame. While sick kids staff did make rare mistakes with drugs, Grange found it highly unlikely that they could have occurred on this scale, with 1 nursing team on a single unit, most in the middle of the night, and all serious enough to kill. The theory of multiple, repeated, concentrated, fatal errors must be rejected as untenable, he wrote. He also absolved the doctors, since no evidence existed that any of them had consistently been on shift for the suspicious deaths. And he found that Nels hadn't committed the murders. If anything, additional evidence that came out during the hearings suggested that others had opportunities to kill the babies, he found. In a perfect world, she would not have been arrested, charged, or prosecuted, he wrote. Grange seemed to think that the culpability lay with another nurse. And he believed that the government order setting up the commission entitled him to identify anyone who played a role in the babies' deaths. But the nurses and their professional organization, whose lawyers described the commission as a witch hunt, contested the idea that Grange could name a culprit, both during the hearing and all the way up to the eventual Ontario Supreme Court ruling. Siding with the nurses, the High Court found that identifying a suspect was outside the scope of Grange's commission. It would be tantamount to rendering a guilty verdict outside of a trial, without giving any of the accused parties an opportunity to defend themselves, impeding their civil rights. The ruling came down partway through the commission, as Traynor was testifying, changing the rules as to what could be asked and what Grange could include in his final report. Ultimately, Grange was prevented from assigning guilt. He never named a name. What if, however, there wasn't a name? What if the babies hadn't been murdered after all? Before placing his hand on the Bible, David Seckham touched his watch. Seckham is dyslexic. The watch is on the left, he remembered, putting his right hand on the book in front of him. In 1983, before the Grange Commission wrapped up, Seckham testified as an expert witness about his latest findings on a digoxin-like substance in infants. As part of his work as a medical biochemist at a Vancouver hospital, Seckham conducted lab tests on patients. He had recently run a digoxin test on a tiny, premature infant with an irregular heart rate. The test turned out to be positive, but no record of digoxin appeared on the baby's chart. Seckham waited a week and tested the baby again. By that point, any mistaken dose would have been cleared from the infant's system. Not only was the second test positive, the digoxin levels were higher than before, he said. Well, this is strange, he thought. Seckham sent the sample to half a dozen labs, all of them returned positive results, all at different levels, including some at levels high enough to be toxic, he told me. The labs were picking up a naturally occurring substance that wasn't digoxin but was similar enough to fool the tests. In further research, Seckham also found the substance in other infants, and he determined that its effect was additive, meaning that if a baby had the substance in her system and was given the actual drug, her supposed digoxin level could increase to a level that appeared to be toxic. What we were saying is, hey guys, if you're hanging your hat on digoxin numbers, you really want to be careful because in this particular age group, in these very sick babies, there is something in their circulation that's not digoxin but it's very similar to it that will give you a false positive reading, Seckham said, referring to his Grange testimony. Seckham wasn't the only one to cast doubt on the toxicological evidence. Skepticism had surfaced early as to whether post-mortem digoxin tests could be trusted. George Sambura, a toxicologist who worked with the prosecution, spent months developing new methods of finding the drug in tissue samples. Experts agreed that tests on samples exhumed months after death didn't reliably measure exact digoxin levels. Post-mortem blood samples also faced questions. When a person dies, digoxin leaches out of their tissues and into bodily fluids. In one study, Sambura analyzed blood samples from 14 children who died at Sick Kids while on digoxin, separate from the suspicious deaths. One child showed a reading of 169.6 ng/ml. We couldn't say conclusively they were poisoned, even after all our research into it, Sambura told a reporter in 1982. As a layperson I could say they were very suspicious, but as a scientist, I could only say it was a strong possibility, he added. After Justin Cook died, Sick Kids started routinely testing post-mortem digoxin levels. In 608 autopsies, 97 children had positive digoxin readings, including 12 who had no record of taking the drug. Another doctor blamed the deaths on MBT, mercaptobenzothiazole, a chemical used in the rubber-making process. Gavin Hamilton, a retired radiologist based in London, Ontario, told me he felt morally compelled to expose what he considers to be the dangers of MBT. In the 1980s, some of his patients had allergic reactions, including 2 that were life-threatening after routine dye injections. Hamilton had the syringes tested and learned that MBT was seeping out from the rubber seals and plunger stoppers. Hamilton's theory, which he set out in a 2011 book, The Nurses Are Innocent, The Digoxin Poisoning Fallacy, held that MBT contamination from syringes and other medical equipment poisoned the babies, who were already on the brink. Now 94, Hamilton told me that some batches of rubber might have higher concentrations of MBT, likening it to pockets of unmixed flour in bread dough. Still, the deaths were concentrated on a single ward of Sick Kids, not in other parts of the hospital or other Canadian hospitals, and they stopped abruptly after Susan Nels was arrested. To Grange, the fact that digoxin was present in babies who hadn't been prescribed the medication in their tissues and, in Justin Cook's case, in blood samples taken before death was enough to show that they'd received an unauthorized dose. And even if a digoxin-like substance had elevated the readings, it couldn't account for the sky-high results, he found. I may eventually be proven wrong because the toxicologic evidence upon which I in part based my conclusion may be proved wrong or inadequate, Grange wrote. But I shall have done the best I can with the material at hand. Sandler, Nels's lawyer, told me that it was nonsense that the Sick Kids readings were bogus, even if false positives were possible. You would have expected if there were false digoxin readings, then babies would have been dying during another team's duty. But that's not what happened, he said. Throughout, the cardiologists at Sick Kids largely attributed the deaths to the infant's conditions or other natural causes. Let's not forget these were very sick babies, and with their serious heart problems they were quite literally born to die, Dr. Richard Rowe, the hospital's head of cardiology until 1986, testified at the Grange Commission. Regardless, the hospital had problems, despite its world-class care, according to a 1982 government report cited in Bisland's book. Among them, no one in the cardiac unit reported the climbing death rate to hospital administrators or patient safety bodies. Drug administration errors were too common for a hospital of its stature. Parents had to scrounge for information about their children. And the hospital lacked security. Anyone could wander the hallways, no visitor identification required. Separately, there seemed to be a disconnect between the nursing staff, most, if not all, of whom were female, and the revered male doctors. Dr. Fowler, the cardiologist who had told police about Nels's strange look as she wrote up Justin Cook's death report, considered himself a troubleshooter with the nurses, but he didn't know that they worked in teams, Bisland's book said. Dr. Robert Freedom, who succeeded Dr. Rowe as cardiology chief, told investigators that Nels was constantly suggesting to the residents that certain babies be put on N4 in case of emergency. In most cases the residents didn't agree and thought it unusual, according to Bisland's book. The night Kevin Paxi died, she was concerned about his condition, looked for help from the doctors on duty, and was frustrated when two of them shrugged her off. Shouldn't they have considered her opinion as a medical professional? The children's deaths and, in all likelihood, the ensuing publicity sparked changes at Sick Kids. The institution increased its supervision of the staff. By early 1982, the hospital had started to use unit-dose syringes, where drugs are dosed at a central pharmacy, rather than by nurses measuring from vials of medication. Our ID cards are checked, and if you are without one, you're questioned, a hospital administrator told a reporter in May 1982. Today, the hospital is once again known as a world leader in pediatric care. A spokeswoman for Sick Kids said it had no one available to comment for this story. Trainer never returned to Sick Kids after her team was sent home following Justin Cook's death. She spent at least the next 3.5 years on paid leave from the hospital, according to Bisland. She reportedly went into occupational health sometime after, and died in 2011. Cox, the reporter, considered Trainer another victim of the whole affair. If she did know anything more about how the babies died, he concluded she would never tell. She was going to carry that forever, he told me. And if she could have done something to stop it, she was going to carry that forever. Nels returned to the nursing profession, first in the kidney dialysis unit of Sick Kids after some lobbying on her part, and later at a hemodialysis unit in Belleville, her hometown. In 1985, she married, and she and her husband had 3 children. Exonerated twice over, she became an advocate for the nursing profession, delivering talks on legal issues to colleagues in the field. In 1999 and 2015, Queen's University and Nipissing University, respectively, awarded her honorary degrees. Nipissing noted her courageousness in defending the profession in a brief write-up about the accolade. Nels couldn't be reached for comment, and her husband didn't respond to requests for comment. "I truly, honestly don't feel special," Nels said in a video related to the Nipissing degree. "My life presented me with circumstances that I wouldn't wish on anyone, and I hope that no one ever, a nurse in particular, never has to go through that kind of thing again. We're recording now. I want to start at my birth, I tell my mom." We both laugh. We're sitting in her sunny home office in Cambridge, Ontario, in May 2024. Both of us are nervous. We've never talked in depth about my heart issues, but over the past couple of years, I've been diving into my own cardiac history, and she agreed to an interview. 5 minutes into our conversation, she stops me. She wants me to know some context, how there was an inquiry in the months before my birth, how Sick Kids patients with heart defects were dying. Seemingly murdered, she says. I had never heard this before, in all the time I'd spent at the hospital. Before I was 4 years old, I had the 2 stopgap surgeries and the Von Tan operation at Sick Kids, and every year I went back for a day of tests and an appointment with my pediatric cardiologist. At 18, I graduated to the adult cardiac clinic across the street. It's unlikely that any of the nurses who treated me overlapped with Nels, though at least 3 of the same cardiologists were still there when I was first admitted. My own pediatric cardiologist rejoined the staff at Sick Kids in 1983, after training there in the late 1970s, but he told me he didn't remember anything about the so-called digoxin deaths. He was an unflappable doctor, and his care was steady and kind. Though my heart's anomalies were rarely far from my mind, I flourished. Last year, I got a digital cache of over 1,000 pages of my Sick Kids medical records, every dose of medication, every test, every doctor's observation for 18 years. Poring over it, I could almost hear the click-click of keys turning, locks opening, my story being revealed. In the nurse's notes, with their faded loops of cursive and hieroglyphic abbreviations, I could see their care for me. They documented my likes, Cheerios, and dislikes, porridge. One nurse advised against putting an 4 in my right hand because I sucked my right thumb, another noted that I'd be accompanied by a blue Care Bear called Bubba. Later, I read Grange's final report, and it was easy to see how those babies were like me. Babies whose color turned dusky when they cried, who needed medicine to fortify their hearts, whose parents stayed watchful by their bedsides. Justin Cook's tricuspid valve was closed up, just like mine. He died hours before he could get his surgery, the same type of procedure I would receive in the same hospital a few years later. In the end, the public never got the accountability it wanted following the deaths. The parents have had to find their own ways of resolving the question of whether their babies died of natural causes or at the hands of a killer who was never caught. The case remains unsolved, either one of Toronto's deadliest mass murders or a tragic coincidence. For most observers, the main questions involving the sick kids' deaths are, how did the infants die and who, if anyone, was responsible? I'm also preoccupied with another question, why did I live? It seems that I was the beneficiary of those losses, a baby with an abnormal heart who thrived in part because of the measures put in place after the children's deaths. But in the end, I don't have an answer to either question. My only response is to sign the closing papers on an apartment with honeyed hardwood floors, to book a plane ticket to visit a friend in Chicago, to cheer on my nephew as he reads me a chapter book for the first time, to board the amusement park ride that spins me upside down, to feel my muscles grind as I curl a dumbbell, to relish the wrinkles that crinkle my eyes, to say yes as much as I humanly can. Yes, let's do this. Yes, let's go there. My only response is to live a full life. To report this piece, I contacted more than 36 people, companies, and organizations. Some didn't respond, others declined to comment or said they weren't able to comment on events from so long ago. I attempted to reach everyone mentioned above in multiple ways, as well as others who were involved, some couldn't be reached, and many have died. This account is based on interviews, books, Samuel Grange's final report, court documents, newspaper archives, scientific studies, and other materials. This piece is the fourth in our series, Heart of the Matter, a special collaboration from narratively and creative nonfiction that explores love and matters of the heart. You can learn more about this special series and check out the rest of the stories we published here. Lee Camping Carter is the head of newsletters at the Wall Street Journal. She's also the writer of the Heart Dialogues, a Substack for people born with heart conditions, and the people who care about them. Her writing has appeared in the WSJ, the New York Observer, the Walrus, Guernica, the Brooklyn Rail and elsewhere. She lives in New York. Jessie Sposato is Narratively's executive editor. She also writes about social issues, feminism, health, friendship, and culture for a variety of outlets. She is currently working on a collection of essays about coming of age in the suburbs. Julie Benbassett is an award-winning illustrator, painter, and animator. Story 2. The Colonel's Crime. So the child was called Babu. It was the Colonel's name for him. He said it was because the little fellow looked so wise, but the fact of the matter was he didn't care to call him baby. You see, there had been several babies, sturdy, brown-eyed, pucka sons and daughters of the house. Which, alas, this pretty golden-haired little chap was not. He was nothing in the eyes of the Colonel. But a little unlooked for illegal result, but he was quite beautiful for all that, and his young mother loved him. It was most awful OT, she said, as she stepped out of the train into the arms of the elderly Colonel. And the child, at which the Colonel cast a side glance, wasn't well, and could she get some fresh milk or something for it anyhow? And if this was India, why dash The colonel was quite staggered. The first shock was the sight of the child. He had got accustomed to it as a disagreeable fact on paper, but somehow, when he was called upon to face it, he shied a little. The second shock to his nervous system was the flow of words which issued from the pretty lips of his Fanny, as she got out of the train. It is true he had not seen her for over a year, but it had been, more than aught else, his appreciation of her rare gift of silence which had determined him to run the risk of having her and the child out. It had never occurred to him that the mere accident of motherhood must of itself inevitably have developed, and somewhat sharpened the young girl. A sort of fighting instinct had come to the defenseless creature now that she had the little one to protect. Besides, she was very tired. She had traveled for 3 days and nights all the way from Bombay, with a young child to look after, and no ayah small wonder if she were weary and cross. She hadn't given him a kiss yet, and would she not do it now? For they had come alone into the little sordid empty waiting room of the terminus. Twice he reminded her shyly that she had not even kissed him. It was he who was shy and not she. She was absent and worried and over-fatigued. She said nothing, but she looked kindly and critically into his face for a moment or two, so that somehow he felt small and shabby, and then she turned to a bench hard by and tenderly laid the sleeping child upon it. After that she faced round and gave him both her hands. "I came," she said in her low swift voice, "because of I'm to shew I'm to you, and there was no one to care for I'm." Her lips quivered, and her beautiful soft eyes were full of tears. "Aren't you glad to see me, my dear? You haven't given me one kiss yet." He sat down and held out his arms. She paled, and then the color mounted to her brow. For one instant she hesitated, and then she stooped and laid her lips to his. She was nearly as tall as he, a slim willowy girl and very, very pretty. A moment later she pulled off her hat and threw it upon the table with a pert toss of the head, thus betraying by the subtle yet faithful eloquence of gesture her plebeian origin. In repose, Fanny looked almost patrician. Her nose and mouth were delicately modelled, her eyes large and beautiful in color and expression, her skin of exquisite texture and transparency, and now without her hat the soft bright hair escaped in picturesque disorder, curling in little silken rings all about her ears and neck, and giving to the young creature a very candid and childlike air. This, and the defiant yet alluring little pout and toss of the head, tempted the colonel to take her once more into his arms, more masterfully this time. He kissed her with ardor. He whispered reproachfully, yet fondly, in her ear, "My little girl had half forgotten me, is she glad to see me again?" She freed herself without excitement, and it did not occur to her to answer him. It was all so strange, so hot, so odd, so dirty. She looked towards the child as he slept on the bench, and noticed great beads of perspiration standing out on his white brow, upon which the golden rings of hair lay moist, and dark ridges of dirt disfigured his pretty face, and the coal dust had collected in drips about the dimpled corners of his mouth and round his little nose. The weary, travel-stained baby appealed to her before all else. Fanny had but one set of emotional sympathies, none over for an emergency, only just enough to run a single interest at a time with. When these were in use, the most urgent call met with no response. The child claimed them now. "Poor little wee," she cooed, lifting him gently and wiping the damp from his forehead. then supporting him on one knee, she dragged her hat from the table with the free hand and put it on. "Can't we be getting along?" she asked a little irritably. "It's that stuffy air I'm frightened for. I'm not, but what it seems worse out of doors." "Have we far to go?" "It's a long drive," answered the colonel, "but I'm going to take you now where you'll get a rest and a wash and something to eat, and go on in the evening." At the travelers' bungalow preparations had been made for the reception of the party, and an ayah awaited them. The bungalow was about a mile from the station, and when they drove up to the door, in a cloud of dust, they were received by quite a little crowd of villagers, while low obeisances saluted the young Englishwomen on all sides. To Fanny, it all seemed mysterious and grand, yet upon the limited, uncultivated surface of her mind the scene made comparatively little impression. It was very queer, and that was all. The miracles of color, the crowd and tangle of marvelous costumes that thronged the narrow, ill-paved streets through which they drove, the grotesque figures, the fierce dark faces, the fretful Arab horses, thrilled no familiar chord in Fanny's memory. Alas! For her the thousand tales of Arabia had never existed to flood her childish mind with their enchantment. The grinding yoke of poverty and ignorance had lain heavy upon her through all her youth. And now she had come all this long way for the sake of her child, as she had confessed to the colonel with a direct simplicity, and an unconscious appeal for sympathy, which had failed to touch him. Dormant as yet in this girl's nature, there were the elements of an intense and devoted passion. Possibly also the latent germs of a strong capacity for the mere sensuous appreciation of beauty in the abstract, but the chances were that none of these things would ever be called into being. A long course of training would have to lead up to their development, whereas the exigencies of maternity, with their eternal calls upon her emotions, were too early using up all the best material in her nature. Perhaps that which laid most hold upon what imagination Fanny had, was the respectful awe in which the colonel was evidently held wherever he went. The bowing and scraping and salaaming appealed directly to her understanding, and to the tradition of her life, that groveling of the humble and weak of the earth, to power and wealth. Insensibly it increased her liking and moved her admiration for the short, red-faced man whose word was law, and whose passage was almost royal, and who was yet Babu's father. The last was, however, in the very depths of Fanny's heart, the colonel's real title to honor. It was the old story. 2 years furlough at home with nothing to do. The dressmaker's assistant was very young, very lovely, and absolutely unprotected. He sought an opportunity of shewing her kindness, and she was grateful. Her soft surprised eyes, her rare nervous speech, the pretty, warm, delicate color that came and went in her cheeks when she met him, charmed inexpressibly the man who had passed the greater part of his life in India. He became desperately enamored. And when the time came for him to return to India, parted from the girl with keen regret. He easily persuaded himself that this little affair in no way defrauded his own true wife. He told himself that he was devoted to her and to his children, while his fancy for Fanny was, well, quite different. It was, therefore, with no great enthusiasm that he received the news of Babu's birth. Fanny's letter, informing him thereof, was ill-written and ill-spelt, but the extraordinary mingling of pride and joy, and most childish ignorance with which she told her story, touched him to the quick. He wrote tenderly in reply and sent her money. All went well for a time, but by and by when Babu came to be A year old, the innocent joy and pride died out of her letters, and the colonel began to fear that some pressure was being brought to bear upon her, to clear away the wicked glamour and glory of her happiness, and to bring home to her only the disgrace and shame. The colonel was kind-hearted. He thought it was a pity, and he was fond of the girl. He turned it all over in his mind. He was a very great man in his district, and if he could keep the thing a secret from the Europeans in the station where his headquarters were during the rainy season, he could easily cause it to be known that it would be to the interest of no native to betray him. With ordinary caution the story need never reach the ears of his wife, and taking it all together, he believed it might be done with impunity. Fanny was overjoyed. She came out by the P&O, calling herself a soldier's wife, under the name of Mrs. Barnes. It had been very lonely work in England, and more than all else she had longed from the very first to show her darling to his father. No one could fail to love him. That the colonel might find pleasure in her and none in the child never once occurred to her. Yet when they met at the hot, dusty little Indian railway station, it seemed to her that it all turned out so badly. She was tired and cross. The baby was dirty. All the colonel's attention was given to herself, all his desire was for a kiss, which seemed to her so superfluous. Whereas, had he but taken the boy in his arms and praised the little one, she would have thrown her arms around his neck and have kissed him with all her soul. She was too proud, and too anxious, to be able to speak what was in her mind, or to claim unwilling admiration for her treasure. A few weak words had escaped from her full heart, but had missed their mark, so that already a minor chord was struck in the mager melody of Fanny's happiness. But now, after all, here she was, safe under the powerful protection of the boy's father. She presently appeared in the sitting room of the ugly traveler's bungalow, the great comfortless barn of a place after a bath and change of dress. Smoking and thinking not all. He looked up as she came in. How lovely she was! There was hope and happiness in her tender young face. The dazzle and glory of the noonday seemed to shine in her great violet eyes, in which, also, there was a half-timid appeal. A sudden, overmastering impulse of admiration and delight took possession of him, and a warm self-congratulation. She was one of those favored beings who are absolutely good to look at, and who are always in harmony with the place and hour. As she approached him, he read a mingling of joy and dread in the lovely face. He perceived a nervous coming and going of the warm, delicate color, which delighted him infinitely. She paused for an instant and looked round. A door opened and shut, and then she came right up and stood before him. Over her shoulder he saw the ayah approaching with the child. She put her hands impulsively on his shoulders, and her eyes, as she gazed into his face, were both mournful and radiant. At heart, she was persuaded of the success of her cause, but she was shy of speaking. "Can't you love him?" she burst out pleadingly. Then she suddenly flung herself upon her knees on the floor, and held out her arms for the child. In this perfectly unstudied attitude of devotion and submission she prayed for the father's love. "Kiss him," she cried passionately. "Oh, you must, you will love him." Then with a burst of helpless tear, "I'll go no further, not a step, if you cannot take to him." The colonel stooped, and lifted the little fellow in his arms. "What's it all about, my dear?" he asked gently. Come, don't cry. Why, of course I intended to kiss this young Turk. With that, the smiling, red-faced man pressed his mustache to the child's soft, round cheek. He then handed him back hastily to the ayah. You poor, tired, pretty, little darling. Come and have something to eat. His arms were round Fanny, her face was buried on his shoulder. He patted the pretty head. And did she think no one cared for her precious baby? Isn't he a beauty? She whispered back, lifting the sweet April face, flooded with sunshine now. I knew you couldn't help it. Child. She was thinking of the kiss he had given the... By George, no. I couldn't help it, he murmured with his lips on her hair. She could not see his eyes and was dreamily content. Story 3. The story of Hercules and Cacus. This is the story of Hercules and Cacus, as told by King Evander to his guest Aeneas. These ceremonies, these ritual feasts, this altar of powerful divinity have not been set up by us through empty superstition or neglect of the old gods. We render sacrifice, my Trojan friend, because we were saved from deadly perils. And pay honor each year where honor is due. First of all, look at that rock-hung cliff, see how great masses of rock have been flung far apart and the mountain muddied solate, how the boulders have left a great trail of ruin behind them. Here was a vast and yawning cavern, so deeply set that the sun's light could never penetrate it, the home of that dread figure Cacus, half man, half beast. The ground was always steaming with fresh slaughters, and, nailed to the insolent gates hung pale faces of men, grimly stained with blood. Vulcan was the father of this monster, and as Cacus moved his great bulk about, his mouth belched this father's deadly fires. But there came a time when help was brought to in our longing through the coming of a god. For the great avenger came, Hercules, fresh from killing the three-formed Geryon, and proudly rich in spoils, drove the huge bulls this way in triumphant. These oxen filled the valley and the river banks. But Cacus, with his wild robber's mind, determined that there should be no limit to his daring attempts. In crime and cunning, bore off from the folds 4 splendid bulls and as many lovely heifers. And in order that their footprints might not give the true course away, he dragged them by the tails to his cave, and hid them beneath the dark rock, with the tracks of their journey pointing in the opposite direction. Thus, if anyone looked, no clues led to the cavern. In the meantime, when Hercules was moving his well-fed herds from their folds and getting ready for his departure, the oxen began to bellow at leaving. And all the woods were filled with their plaint and cry as they left the hills. Onoft cows returned the call, and by lowing, where she was imprisoned in the great cavern, cheated Cacus of his hopes. Then did Hercules' anger blaze out in fierce wrath, he snatched up his arms and his great knobbed club, and rushed to the heights of the towering crag. For the first time then our eyes saw Cacus afraid and in confusion. He fled straightway, swifter than the east wind, to his cave, and fear gave wings to his feet. He had scarcely shut himself in, and broken the chains to let down the huge boulder which his father's skill had hung in iron. He had scarcely fortified his entrance with this barrier, when Hercules was on him in his anger, ranging over every approach, facing this way and that, gnashing his teeth. 3 times in the heat of his wrath he covered all the Aventine hill, 3 times essayed the rocky entrance in vain, 3 times sank back weary in the valley. Now a sharp crag of flint, cut sheer from the rock on every side, rose high and clear over the ridge of the cavern, a proper nesting place for birds of ill omen. It sloped from the ridge and leaned towards the river on the left. Coming on it from the right, Hercules pushed in the opposite direction, shook it hard, tore it free from its lowest roots, and hurled it violently down. The great space of heaven thundered with the shock, the banks were flung apart, and the water flowed back in terror. But the den and great palace of Caucasus were now revealed. And the gloomy caverns lay open to their depths, as if the depths of the earth were forced wide open, unlocking the infernal regions and disclosing those pale kingdoms hated of the gods, as if one gazed down upon the vast abyss with the shades trembling at the inrush of light. On Caucasus then, bellowing strangely now that he was caught by the unexpected light of day and pent up in the hollow of the rock, Hercules rained missiles, calling all his weapons into assistance and pressing him hard with branches and great millstones. But the giant, who had no other way of escape from his danger, belched great clouds of smoke from his jaws, a wonder, indeed, and wrapped his den in impenetrable obscurity, blinding the sight of the eye. The cavern was filled with the smoky night of flame whirled together with darkness. The great heart of Hercules could not let this be, and he flung himself through the fire in one great leap, where the smoke whirled thickest and the great cave seethed in black cloud. Here, where Caucasus was vomiting out his useless fires in the gloom, he caught him and clasped him as if in a knot. Inexorably he choked him till his eyes burst forth and his throat was dry of blood. Straightway the doors were torn down and the glumidin flung open. The stolen oxen and the booty that had been denied on oath were revealed to the light of day, and the hideous corpse was dragged out by its feet. Men could not have their fill of gazing on those terrible eyes, on the face of the monster and his hairy, bristly chest, on the flames that had been dried up in his throat. From that time has this divine honor been paid to Hercules, and a happy posterity celebrates the day. Story found. 1. The body. The girl was laid out like a party favor, legs twisted in a bow, mouth stuffed with peppermint tears. I lit a smoke. The sugar in her wounds sparkled under the crime scene lights. Pretty. Like a liar's smile. 3rd one this month, said Martinez, the coroner. She peeled back the licorice stitching with tweezers. Same sick bastard. You know what this means. I did. The sweet tooth killer was back. And he was goddamn poetic. 2. The shop. Boudreaux's Sweets hadn't seen a customer since Clinton was in office. The sign hung crooked, the letters bleeding rust. Inside smelled like ghosts and molasses. My old man's ledger sat open on the counter. Page 23, Remy's birthday cake, 1989. I didn't need to read the recipe. I remembered the secret ingredient. 3. The Whitneys. Mama Solange's voodoo shop reeked of cat piss and regret. Your brother's hungry, detective, she said, shuffling tarot cards with knife-scarred hands. Ain't had nothing sweet in 30 years. Remy's dead. She flipped a card. The hanged man, sticky with taffy. The dead don't stay dead here. They just get inventive. 4. The bayou. The shack leaned like a drunk on payday. Inside, jars of teeth, a rusted cake knife, and one hell of a stink. Then I saw it. A child's shoe in the corner. Size small. Left foot. Chewed laces. Just like the one they'd pulled from the swamp the day Remy vanished. Christ. The shadows laughed. 5. The killer. He came at me in the refinery, fast and sugar wild, teeth gnashing like a gator with a sweet tooth. You left me, Ezra. You were already gone. The gunshot echoed. Remy staggered back, clutching his gut. Honey-thick blood oozed between his fingers. Too late, brother, he giggled, pulling a gummy worm from his pocket. The recipe's already written. Then he fell into the vat. The syrup boiled red. 6. The aftermath. Next morning, a king cake waited on my desk. I cut it open. The plastic baby had my face. I ate it anyway. Tasted like guilt. Like New Orleans. Like the last damn thing I'd ever taste. 7. Int. Morgue, 3:17 a.m. The fluorescents hum like angry wasps. Ezra stares at Remy's sugar-crusted corpse on the slab. Lucia, peeling back the sheet. Y'all share a dentist? His molars are filed to points. Close up, Remy's tongue, split down the middle. Forked. Ezra, pouring bourbon into his coffee. Family trait. A gurgle. Remy's eyes snap open. Lucia, unfazed. Huh. Your brother's still got a sweet tooth. She slams the sheet back over his face. 8. EXT. Bayou, Dawn. Ezra wades through knee-deep sludge, following a trail of jawbreakers. Finds a floating shoebox. Inside. Polaroids of the victims, lollipops shoved in their eye sockets. A cassette tape labeled for Ezzy. His Walkman clicks on. Remy's voice, giggling, wet. You forgot the secret ingredient, brother. SFX, a spoon scraping bone. 9. Int. Boudreaux Sweets, night. Ezra kicks in the boarded up door. The air's thick with the stink of burnt sugar and copper. His flashlight catches. Hooks where copper kettles once hung. Now just dripping wires. Finger-painted symbols on the walls, molasses and blood. A child's stool in the corner. Splinters. Stains. Ezra's phone buzzes. Unknown caller. He answers. Remy, whispering. Check the oven. Ezra pries it open. Inside, a blackened mixing bowl. Filled with baby teeth. One still bleeding. 10. Int. Police station, next morning. Captain LeBlanc, 60s, face like a deflated gumdrop, tosses a file at Ezra. LeBlanc. 3 more disappearances. All diabetics. Coincidence. Photos. A priest last seen buying sugar-free gum. A baker who swore off sucrose. A jazz singer who only drank bitter coffee. Ezra, flipping through. Remy's not just killing. He's collecting. LeBlanc, leaning in. Collecting what, exactly? Ezra, dead serious. The unsweetened. 11. EXT. Cemetery, midnight. Ezra digs up Remy's childhood grave. The coffin. Filled with rock candy. No bones. Just a nest of rat skeletons, their tiny skulls stuffed with cotton candy. A shadow falls over him. Remy, now flesh, now bone, now sugar shine. You were always bad at hide and seek, Ezzy. Twist, Remy's not alive. He's not dead. He's something in between. A hungry thing made of sugar and spite. And he's been watching. 12. Int. Abandoned sugar refinery, night. The air thick with molasses and blood. Ezra follows the trail of crushed peppermints to the heart of the refinery. Remy stands over a boiling copper vat, stirring with a rusted bone. Remy, smiling, teeth filed sharp. You came for the recipe, Ezzy. Ezra racks his shotgun. Ezra. I came to end this. Remy laughs, plunges his hand into the vat, pulls out a handful of molten sugar, dripping like lava. Remy. Too late. It's already in you. 13. The truth. Flashback, 6-year-old Ezra, forcing Remy to eat a spoonful of special sugar, ground glass and graveyard dirt. Ma Man's voice. Some curses need family blood to stick. Ezra vomits black syrup. Remy, grinning. You fed me first, brother. 14. The final ingredient. Remy lunges. They crash into the vat. Boiling sugar swallows them whole. Silence. Then. A hand bursts from the syrup. Ezra crawls out, skin peeling like burnt caramel. The vat bubbles once. Then still. 15. Epilogue, 1 month later. Ezra sits at a Bourbon Street bar, drinking whiskey neat. The bartender slides him a king cake. Bartender. On the house. Ezra cracks it open. Inside, a single human tooth. He pockets it. Fade to black. Text on screen. In New Orleans, the sweetest curses never die. The end. Final body count. Remy, melted into syrup. Ezra, cursed, but alive. The sugar killer's legacy, still baking. Want a post-credits stinger? A sequel hook? Or a bleaker ending? Your call, share. The story's yours now. Story 14. The Typewriter's Confession. The estate sale smelled of mothballs and regret when antique dealer Jacob Whitlock first saw the 1937 Underwood typewriter. Its keys were yellowed with age, but the ribbon was fresh, too fresh for an object that hadn't been used in decades. First click. Jacob tested the typewriter in his shop that night. The E-key stuck. As he walked away to get oil, 3 sharp clicks echoed through the empty store. When he returned, the paper read: Emma Grace Wilcox, missing since October 17, 1983, check the well. The police report confirmed it. Emma Wilcox had vanished after school in '83. They'd searched the old Henderson well but found nothing. Until Jacob showed them where to dig. The list grows. Over the next week, the typewriter produced. Daniel Ruiz, 1991, bones found where it specified beneath an oak tree. Cyril Yang, 1978, class ring discovered in a drainage pipe. Thomas O'Connell, 1989, remains located behind a false wall in his childhood home. Each victim had disappeared within 20 miles of Jacob's shop. Each name appeared in perfect chronological order. Each typed with distinct pressure patterns as if different hands had used the machine. The breakthrough. Jacob found a connection in newspaper archives. All the missing persons had last been seen near the Red Quill bookshop, owned by Luther Graves from 1965 to 2003. Graves had been questioned but never charged. His typewriter-printed alibis were always ironclad. The shop's inventory included: 1 1937 Underwood typewriter, sold in 2004 estate sale. 37 first edition crime novels, each about missing persons. A ledger with coded entries matching the victims' disappearance dates. The final message. At 3:17 a.m., the typewriter sprang to life while Jacob watched. Luther Graves, 2003, look under the keys. Beneath the typewriter's mechanism, Jacob found a child's tooth wedged near the M key. Fingerprint smudges in dried ink, matched to multiple victims. A tiny scroll reading, "They live in the words now." The shop's secret. The abandoned Red Quill bookshop's basement revealed. A wall of handwritten stories describing each disappearance. A collection of personal items arranged like museum exhibits. Luther's final journal entry. The typewriter remembers everything. When you press a key, it keeps part of you forever. I've made them immortal. Now who will tell my story? Epilogue. The typewriter sits in evidence lockup. But guards report clicking noises at night. Fresh names appearing on blank paper. Ink fingerprints that match no living person. Jacob keeps one souvenir, a single keycap Luther had hidden in his journal. The M key. 4 missing. Story 15. The House with Secrets. The listing for 47 Blackwood Lane promised a grand Victorian mansion with original charm. But as real estate agent Claire Mercer stepped through the creaking front door, her clipboard trembled in her hands. The blueprints from the county records showed 12 rooms. The house had 13. The first showing. Claire's laser measure gave conflicting readings in the master bedroom. The west wall was 6 inches too shallow, just enough space for something. Her first potential buyers, the Wilkersons, never showed up for their afternoon appointment. When Claire called, Mrs. Wilkerson sounded confused. "We cancelled yesterday. Some man called saying you'd moved the showing." No one at her office had made that call. The missing room. That night, Claire spread the original 1891 architect's plans across her kitchen table. The differences were subtle but chilling. The pantry was 2 feet narrower in reality. The staircase had 1 extra step. The third-floor hallway extended further than the plans showed. Most disturbing was the small rectangular space between the library and dining room, a room that didn't exist when she'd toured the house. The wall that wasn't there. At 3:17 a.m., Claire's phone buzzed with an alert. The motion sensors at 47 Blackwood had been triggered. The security feed showed static for exactly 47 seconds. A shadow moving through the library. Then a door appearing where solid wall should be. When Claire arrived, she found fresh scratches around the library's baseboards. The scent of cedar and wet earth. A child's marble rolling from nowhere across the floor. The house's history. The Historical Society's records revealed. The original owner, Silas Blackwood, was a taxidermist. In 1903, his entire family vanished over one weekend. The police report noted discrepancies in room dimensions. The house had 37 different owners in 120 years. None stayed more than a year. The final showing. Claire returned with a sledgehammer. The library wall gave way too easily, revealing a hidden study with walls covered in strange equations. Glass jars containing what looked like animal organs, but weren't. A small desk with a ledger labeled Specimen Catalog. The last entry read: "Final experiment successful. The house remembers now. It will keep adding rooms until..." The sentence ended mid-word. Epilogue. 47 Blackwood Lane was condemned. But Claire keeps finding blueprints in her office that change overnight. Voices on her showing recordings that no one heard live. Fresh dirt on her shoes after walking barefoot floors. The new listing just went live. It now shows 14 rooms. Story 14. A flight into Texas. The flight and extradition of Charles F. Dodge unquestionably involved one of the most extraordinary battles with justice in the history of the criminal law. The funds at the disposal of those who were interested in procuring the prisoners' escape were unlimited in extent, and the arch-conspirator for whose safety Dodge was spirited away was so influential in political and criminal circles that he was all but successful in defying the prosecutor of New York County, even supported as the latter was by the military and judicial arm of the United States government. For, at the time that Dodge made his escape, a whisper from Hummel was enough to make the dry bones of many a powerful and ostensibly respectable official rattle and the tongue cleave to the roof of his mouth in terror. Who could accomplish that in which the law was powerless? Hummel. Who could drive to the uttermost ends of the earth persons against whom not a shadow of suspicion had previously rested? Hummel. Who dictated to the chiefs of police of foreign cities what they should or should not do in certain cases, and who could, at the beckoning of his little finger, summon to his dungeon-like offices in the New York Life Building, whither his firm had removed from Center Street, the most prominent of lawyers, the most eminent of citizens, surely none but Hummel. And now Hummel was fighting for his own life. The only man that stood between him and the iron bars of Blackwell's Island was Charles F. Dodge, the man whom he had patted on the knee in his office and called a mascot, when quite in the nature of business he needed a little perjury to assist a wealthy client. Hummel in terror called into play every resource upon which, during 40 years of practice, his tiny tentacles had fastened. Who shall say that while he made a show of enjoying himself nightly with his accustomed lightheartedness in the tenderloin, he did not feel confident that in the end this peril would disappear, like the others which had from time to time threatened him during his criminal career. But Hummel was fully aware of the tenacity of the man who had resolved to rid New York of his malign influence. His nemesis was following him. In his dreams, if he ever dreamed, it probably took the shape of the square-shouldered district attorney in the shadow of whose office building the little shyster practiced his profession. Had he been told that this nemesis was in reality a jovial little man with a round, ruddy face and twinkling blue eyes, he would have laughed as heartily as it was in his power to laugh. Yet such was the fact. A little man who looked less like a detective than a commercial traveler, selling St. Peter's oil or some other cheerful concoction, with manners as gentle and a voice as soft as a spring zephyr, who always took off his hat when he came into a business office, seemingly bashful to the point of self-effacement, was the one who snatched Charles F. Dodge from the borders of Mexico and held him in an iron grip when every influence upon which Hummel could call for aid, from crooked police officials, corrupt judges, and a gang of cutthroats under the guise of a sheriff's posse, were fighting for his release. Jesse Blocker is not employed in New York County, and for business reasons he does not wish his present address known. When he comes to New York he occasionally drops into the writer's office for a cigar and a friendly chat about old times. And as he sits there and talks so modestly and with such quiet humor about his adventures with the Texas Rangers among the cactus-studded plains of the Lone Star State, it is hard even for one who knows the truth, to realize that this man is one of the greatest of detectives, or rather one of the most capable, resourceful, adroit, and quick-wit knights of adventure who ever set forth upon a seemingly impossible errand. It is unnecessary to state just how the district attorney discovered the existence of Jesse, as we knew him. It is enough to say that on Saturday morning, July 23, 1904, he was furnished with the proper credentials and given instructions to proceed at once to New Orleans, Louisiana, and locate, if it were humanly possible to do so, Charles F. Dodge, under indictment for perjury, and potentially the chief witness against Abraham H. Hummel, on a charge of conspiracy. He was told briefly and to the point that, in spite of the official reports from the police headquarters of both New York City and New Orleans to the contrary, there was reason to believe that Dodge was living, although not registered, as a guest at the St. Charles Hotel in the latter city. A partial and inaccurate description of Dodge was given him, and he was warned to use extreme caution to prevent any knowledge of his mission from being made known. Once Dodge had been discovered, he was to keep him under surveillance and wire New York immediately. Accordingly, Jesse left the city upon the same day at 4:45 p.m. and arrived 2 days later, at 9:15 on Monday morning, at New Orleans, where he went directly to the St. Charles Hotel, registered, and was assigned to room number 547 on the 5th floor. Somewhere in the hotel Dodge was secreted. The question was how to find him. For an hour Jesse sat in the hotel foyer and meditatively watched the visitors come and go, but saw no sign of his quarry. Then he arose, put on his hat, and hunted out a stationery store where for 2 cents he bought a bright red envelope. He then visited a ticket scalper's office, secured the owner's business card, and wrote a note on its back to Dodge offering him cheap transportation to any point that he might desire. Armed with this, he returned to the hotel, walked to the desk, glanced casually over a number of telegrams exposed in a rack, and, when the clerk turned his back, placed the note, addressed to Charles F. Dodge, unobserved, upon the counter. The office was a busy one. Guests were constantly depositing their keys and receiving their mail, and, even as Jesse stood there watching developments, the clerk turned round, found the note and promptly placed it in box number 420. The very simple scheme had worked, and quite unconsciously the clerk had indicated the number of the room occupied by Dodge. Jesse lost no time in ascending to the fourth floor, viewed room number 420. Returned to the desk, told the clerk that he was dissatisfied with the room assigned him, and requested that he be given either room number 421, 423, or 425, one of which he stated that he had occupied on a previous visit. After some discussion, the clerk allotted him room number 423, which was almost directly opposite that occupied by Dodge, and the detective at once took up his task of watching for the fugitive to appear. Within the hour the door opened and Dodge and a companion, who subsequently proved to be E.M. Bracken, alias Bradley, an agent employed by Howe and Hummel, left the room, went to the elevator and descended to the dining room upon the second floor. Jesse watched until they were safely ensconced at breakfast and then returned to the fourth floor, where he tipped the chambermaid, told her that he had left his key at the office, and induced her to unlock the door of room number 420, which she did under the supposition that Jesse was the person who had left the chamber in Dodge's company. The contents of the room convinced Jesse that he had found Dodge, for he discovered there 2 grips bearing Dodge's name as well as several letters on the table addressed to him. The detective returned to the hall and had a little talk with the maid. "The old gentleman with you has been quite sick," she said. "How is he today?" "He is some better," answered Jesse. "Yes, he does look better today," she added, "but he surely was powerful sick yesterday. Why, he hasn't been out of his room before 5 or 6 days." This statement was corroborated by Dodge's physical appearance, for he looked haggard and worn. Jesse was now confident that he had found Dodge, in spite of the reports of the New Orleans police to the contrary, and he was also reasonably sure that the fugitive was too sick to leave the hotel immediately. He therefore telegraphed his superiors that he had discovered Dodge and that the latter was ill at the St. Charles Hotel. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon Jesse received a wire from New York as follows: New Orleans Police Department claims party not there. Left for Mexico 3 weeks ago. Ascertain correct destination and wire at once. Jesse at once replied. No question as to identity and presence here at this time. He now took up the task of keeping his quarry under absolute surveillance day and night, which duty from that moment he continued for a period of nearly 10 months. During the remainder of the afternoon and throughout the night Dodge and Bracken remained in room number 420, and during the evening were visited by several strangers, including a plainclothes officer from the New Orleans Police Headquarters. Little Hummel, dining in Longacre Square in the glare of Broadway, was pressing some invisible button that transmitted the power of his influence even to the police government of a city 2,000 miles away. The following day, January 26, at about 8:40 in the morning, Dodge and Bracken descended to the lobby. Bracken departed from the hotel, leaving Dodge to pay the bill at the cashier's window, and Jesse heard him order a cab for the 11:30 a.m. Sunset Limited on the Southern Pacific Railroad and direct that his baggage be removed from his room. Jesse did the same. In the meantime Bracken returned and promptly at 11 a.m. left for the railroad station in a cab with Dodge. Jesse followed in another. As the two passed through the gates the detective caught a glimpse of Dodge's ticket and saw that it had been issued by the Mexican National Railway. Retiring to the telegraph office in the station, he wired New York as follows: Bird flying Sunset Limited. Destination not known. I am with him. He then hastily purchased a ticket to Houston, Texas, and boarded the train. Dodge's companion had bidden him goodbye as the engine started, and Jesse's task now became that of ferreting out Dodge's destination. After some difficulty, he managed to get a glimpse of the whole of the fugitive's ticket and thus discovered that he was on his way to the city of Mexico, via Eagle Pass, Texas. While from the Pullman conductor he learned that Dodge had secured sleeping car accommodation as far as San Antonio, Texas, only. So far all was well. He knew Dodge, but Dodge did not know him, and later on in the afternoon he had the satisfaction of a long talk with his quarry in the observation car, where they amiably discussed together current events and argued politics with the same vehemence as if they had been commercial travelers, thrown fortuitously into each other's company. Dodge, however, cleverly evaded any reference to his destination. When the train reached Morgan City, Louisiana, at 3 p.m., which was the first stop, Jesse wired New York as follows: On Sunset Limited with friend. He has transportation to the city of Mexico, via Eagle Pass, where I am now journeying with him. Answer to Beaumont, Texas. Later in the afternoon he sent an additional message from Lafayette, Louisiana. Have seen transportation of friend and am positive of destination. Dodge was occupying Section 3 of the sleeping car Capitola, and, as became an invalid, retired early. At Beaumont Jesse failed to receive any reply to his various messages, and when the train arrived at Houston no word came from New York until it was almost the time of departure. Waiting until practically the last moment, Jesse hurried through the gates of the Union Station at Houston and bought a ticket to San Antonio. As he was leaving the ticket window, Night Chief of Police John Howard and two officers came hurrying up, inquiring anxiously for Mr. Jesse. The reinforcements had arrived. Outside on the track, the Sunset Limited was just getting underway. The first frantic puffs were being vomited from the funnel. Inside, Dodge was sleeping peacefully in his berth. Jesse, accompanied by Chief Howard, hurried up to the conductor, who was about to swing onto the steps of the sleeper, and ordered him to hold the train till the fugitive could be removed. After some argument, the conductor grumblingly complied, and Dodge was aroused from pleasant dreams of the Creole Quarter to the cold reality of being dragged out of bed by a policeman. He was unceremoniously hustled out of the sleeping car into a carriage and taken to headquarters, where he admitted his identity and remarked, "I know what I am wanted for, but I will never return to New York." In his grip was found the sum of $1,563.15, as well as numerous letters from the law firm of Howe and Hummel and a quantity of newspaper clippings relative to his case. Dodge pleaded with Chief Howard not to lock him up, urging that he was a sick man and offering a goodly sum if he might be taken to a hotel and guarded for the remainder of the night. But what went in New Orleans, did not go in Houston, and the best that Dodge could get for himself was a cot in the ladies' detention room on the second floor of the jail. Early the following morning Jesse visited police headquarters and for the first time met George Ellis, Chief of Police of Houston, for whom he will always have a feeling of deep gratitude for his enthusiastic cooperation and loyalty in the many stirring events that followed. Dodge now received a telegram from New York, which was submitted to Jesse before reaching the prisoner, to the effect that Howe and Hummel were sending on an attorney to aid the fugitive in resisting extradition, and informing him that they had employed Messrs. Hunt and Myers as attorneys to look out for his welfare. These last immediately jumped in medias residential, and on the afternoon of the same day secured a writ of Habeas corpus from Norman J. Cottrell, District Judge of Harris County, Texas. Returnable the following morning. The next day, January 28, Cottrell released Dodge from custody. Jesse had anticipated this and immediately swore out another warrant with the result that the prisoner was rearrested before he left the courtroom. Meantime, the Dodge interests retained another firm of lawyers, Messrs. Andrews and Ball, who, on the following day, secured a second writ of habeas corpus from Judge Ash. The result of the first engagement thus being a draw, counsel on both sides agreed that this writ should not be returnable for 6 days. During this period, District Attorney Jerome employed Messrs. Baker Botts, Parker, and Garwood to represent him and secured from Governor Odell at Albany a requisition on Governor Lanham of Texas for the extradition of the prisoner, which he entrusted to Detective Sergeant Herlihy of the New York Police. Herlihy reached Houston with the papers on the evening of January 30, and on the same train with him came Abraham Koffenberg, a member of the law firm of Howe and Hummel and a nephew of the latter. Likewise also came Bracken, still styling himself E. M. Bradley, and from now on Bracken was the inseparable companion, guide, philosopher, and friend of the unfortunate Dodge, whose continued existence upon this earth had become such a menace to the little lawyer in New York. Herlihy, accompanied by Judge Garwood, proceeded direct to Austin, where they found Dodge already represented by Messrs. Andrews and Ball, who, at the hearing before Governor Lanham, made a strong effort to induce that executive to refuse to honor the requisition of the Governor of New York. This effort failed, and Governor Lanham issued his warrant, but Herlihy had no sooner returned to Houston for the purpose of taking possession of the prisoner than he was served with an injunction enjoining him, together with Chief of Police Ellis, from taking Dodge into custody, pending a hearing upon a new habeas corpus which had been issued by Judge Waller T. Burns of the United States District Court for the Southern District of Texas. This new writ was returnable February 9. After exhaustive but futile argument by the counsel for Dodge, Judge Burns remanded the prisoner to Herlihy's custody to be returned to the state of New York, but this decision had no sooner been rendered than an appeal was taken therefrom by Dodge's lawyers, and the prisoner released upon bail fixed at $20,000. During this period Dodge was quartered under guard at the Rice Hotel in Houston, and the day following the argument the $20,000 bail was put up in cash and Dodge released from custody. In the meantime, however, Jesse, knowing that no sum, however large, would deter Hummel from spiriting Dodge out of the country, had made his arrangements to secure a new extradition warrant from the Governor of Texas, so that if the prisoner did succeed in getting beyond the Southern District of the Federal Court of Texas, he could be seized and conveyed to New York. Of course someone had to keep watch over Dodge while Jesse hurried to Austin to see the governor, and it was decided to leave Sergeant Herlihy, reinforced by a number of local detectives for that purpose. But while the watchful Jesse was away, Bracken proceeded to get busy in the good old Howe and Hummel fashion. Lots of people that Herlihy had never seen before turned up and protested that he was the finest fellow they had ever met. And as Herlihy was, in fact, a good fellow, he made them welcome and dined and wined at their expense. Until he woke up in the Menger Hotel in San Antonio and inquired where he was. Jesse meantime had returned from Austin to discover that Dodge with his companions, Koffenberg and Bracken, had slipped out of Houston early in the morning of February 11, after disposing of Herlihy and eluding the watchfulness of Herlihy's assistants. Hummel was leading, and by 10 o'clock the next morning Dodge and his comrades were on board an English merchantman lying in the harbor of Galveston. Later in the same day the Hummel interests chartered from the Southern Pacific Railroad for the sum of $3,000 the sea-going tug Hughes, to which Dodge was now transferred for the purpose of being conveyed to the port of Tampico in the Republic of Mexico. But here Hummel's wires became crossed with Jerome's, and unfortunately for the little lawyer, the persons from whom the tug had been leased turned out to be closely allied with the prosecution's interests, with the result that the captain of the tug was instructed by his superiors under no consideration to put into any Mexican port, but on the contrary, to delay his departure from the harbor of Galveston for a period of 2 days and then to proceed only as far as Brownsville, Texas, where he should compel the debarkation of the fugitive. The captain, who was a good sport as well as a good officer, promptly threw himself into the part and told Bracken and Koffenberg that it was evident from the barometer that a severe storm was approaching, which must have had a sinister implication to these two unfortunate gentlemen, and that he could not think of putting to sea. Once the storm had blown over, the tug started out across the blue waters of the Gulf of Mexico. But now Bracken and Koffenberg were informed for the first time that it was impossible to consider putting into any port of the Republic of Mexico, since to do so would cause international complications and compel the revocation of the captain's license. In desperation, the Hummel interests offered the captain $5,000 in cash to disregard his instructions and put into Tampico, but the worthy sea dog was adamant. It was probably worth $5,000 to him to see 3 gentry of this pattern so much put about, while Dodge and his accomplices were dallying in the harbor of Galveston. Jesse was taking advantage of his opportunity to proceed at once by railroad to Alice, Texas, which at that time was the furthermost southern point reached by any railway in the direction of Brownsville. On his arrival, he at once applied to Captain John R. Hughes, commanding Company D of the Texas Rangers, who received him with great joy and ordered a detachment of the Rangers to meet the tug at Point Isabella at the mouth of the Rio Grande River on the border of Mexico. In the meantime, Jesse started on a toilsome stage journey to Brownsville, across 170 miles of desert, which occupied 2 days and nights, and necessitated his going without sleep for that period. During the trip Jesse heard no word of English and had as his associates only Mexican cattlemen. Every 15 miles a fresh relay of broncos was hitched to the stage, and after a few moments' rest the misery began again. Jesse had been hurrying toward Brownsville by stage while Dodge, Koffenberg, and Bracken were landing at Point Isabella, where they were kept under close surveillance by Sergeant Tom Ross of the Rangers. Thence they took the train to Brownsville, registering at the Miller House under the assumed names of C.F. Doherty, A. Kuntzman and E. M. Barker, all of Oklahoma. But, although they knew it not, Sergeant Tom was at their elbow, and had Dodge attempted to cross the border into Mexico he would instantly have been placed under arrest. As Brownsville was within the southern district of the Federal Court of Texas, Jesse decided not to arrest Dodge until he should actually attempt flight, and when Dodge and his companions, on the following morning, February 15th, entered the stage, the same upon which Jesse had arrived, and started for Alice, Jesse and Tom Ross procured the best horses they could find and started after them, keeping just in sight of the stage. Dodge's intention in making this move was to take the Mexican International Railway at Alice and cross over to Mexico via Laredo. Jesse and Ross covered the 74 miles from Brownsville to Santa La Cruz Ranch by 4 in the afternoon, which was fairly strenuous work for a New York detective, and here found themselves so sore and exhausted from their ride that they were glad to hire a pair of horses and buggy with which to complete the journey to Alice. Luckily they were able to get into telephonic communication with various ranch owners along the road and arranged to have fresh relays of horses supplied to them every 20 miles, and here also Jesse called up Captain Hughes at Alice, and suggested that he substitute for the regular night clerk at the city hotel one of the privates of the Rangers by the name of Herod. Dodge and his companions arrived in Alice on February 17, and, as Jesse had anticipated, repaired at once to the city hotel, where, inasmuch as they were dry from the dust of their trip and depressed by lack of society, they entered at once into an enthusiastic and confidential friendship with the man behind the counter in the hotel office, sublimely ignorant that they were unfolding to a member of the Texas Rangers all their most secret intentions. Herod was just as glad to see Dodge as Dodge apparently was to see Herod, and kindly offered to assist the fugitive to get into Mexico in any way that the latter desired. Dodge, for his part, took advantage of his usefulness to the extent of requesting him to purchase them railroad tickets, the plan being to leave Alice the following morning for Monterrey, Mexico. 3 hours after the stage bearing Dodge and his party pulled up at the city hotel, Tom Ross and Jesse drove in behind a pair of fagged out Broncos at 2 in the morning. Jesse had had no sleep of any sort and no proper nourishment for 5 days, and had just strength enough left to drag himself up one flight of stairs and tumble into bed, from which he did not emerge for many hours. In the meantime day broke and Dodge, Coffenberg, and Bracken, having breakfasted, drove comfortably down to the International Railway Station and settled themselves in the smoker, but they had no sooner given this direct evidence of their intention before Captain Hughes entered and placed Dodge under arrest. The latter's surprise may be appreciated when it is stated that from the time the three had left Houston, they had no idea that they were being followed and believed that they had completely foiled Jesse and his assistants. While Jesse had been chasing Dodge across the desert, his lawyers had not been idle and had secured at Austin another extradition warrant from Governor Lanham, who, on receiving news of the arrest, promptly instructed Captain Hughes by wire to assume charge of the prisoner and to deliver him into the hands of the New York officer to be conveyed to New York. There now began such a legal battle as the state of Texas had never known. Hummel had been forced into his last ditch and was fighting desperately for life. Through Coffenberg he at once applied for a new writ of habeas corpus in Nueces County and engaged counsel at Corpus Christi to assist in fighting for the release of the prisoner. Precisely as Hummel had intended, Chief Wright of Nueces rode into Alice and demanded the prisoner from Captain Hughes. As Hummel had not intended, Captain Hughes refused to surrender the prisoner and told Chief Wright to go to well. He told him that he intended to obey his commander-in-chief, the governor of Texas. On February 20, Hummel, through Coffenberg, attempted to get another writ of habeas corpus in B County, and promptly the B chief came buzzing over and demanded Dodge, but to him Hughes replied even as he had spoken to Wright. Excitement in Alice had now reached such a pitch that Judge Burns, of the federal court, in Houston, ordered United States Marshal John W. Vann, of Alice, to assume charge of the prisoner. The indomitable Hughes, however, paid no more attention to the United States Marshal than he had to the local chiefs. But the situation was so delicate and the clash of authority might so easily have resulted in bloodshed that it was finally agreed by all parties that the best thing to do was to have the prisoner returned to Houston in the joint custody of Captain Hughes of the Rangers and the United States Marshal. Jesse, through his counsel, in proper course made application to forfeit Dodge's bond and remand him to jail, but the Hummel attorneys finally induced the court, on the plea that to confine Dodge in jail would be detrimental to his already badly impaired health, to permit the prisoner to go free on a greatly increased bond, nevertheless restricting his movements to Harris County, Texas. While Jesse had fought a winning battle up to this point, he was at the end of his resources so far as the extradition of the prisoner was concerned, for Dodge was now at liberty, pending the decisions upon the habeas corpus proceedings of the United States Circuit Court of Appeals at Fort Worth, and the United States Supreme Court at Washington. But his orders were to bring Dodge back to New York. Hence, with the aid of some new men sent him from the north, he commenced an even closer surveillance of the prisoner than ever before by both day and night. Meantime, Koffenberg departed for New York, fleeing from the wrath of Judge Burns, who had issued a summons for him for contempt of the federal court on the ground that he had induced Dodge to attempt to jump his bond. In place of the blustering Koffenberg was sent another member of the famous law firm of Howe and Hummel, David May, an entirely different type of man. May was as mild as a day in June, as urbane as Koffenberg had been insolent. He fluttered into Houston like a white dove of peace with the proverbial olive branch in his mouth. From now on, the tactics employed by the representatives of Hummel were conciliatory in the extreme. Mr. May, however, did not long remain in Houston, as it was apparent that there was nothing to be done by either side. Pending the action of the courts, and in any event Dodge was abundantly supplied with local counsel. The time had now come when Hummel must have begun to feel that the fates were against him, and that a 20-year term in state prison was a concrete possibility even for him. In the meantime, Dodge and Bracken had taken up their headquarters at the Rice Hotel in the most expensive suite of rooms in the house, a new scheme for getting the prisoner beyond the reach of the New York courts apparently having been concocted. Dodge was now indulged in every conceivable luxury and vice. He was plunged into every sort of excess. There was no debauchery which Bracken could supply that was not his, and their rapid method of existence was soon the talk of the county, and continued to be so for 10 long months. There is more than one way to kill a cat, and more than one method of wiping out the only existing witness against a desperate man striving to escape the consequences of crime. Dodge's daily routine was somewhat as follows. He never slept at his own hotel, but arose in the morning between 10 and 11 o'clock, when he was at once visited by Bracken and supplied with numerous drinks in lieu of the breakfast for which he never had any desire. At noon the two would have luncheon with more drinks. In the afternoon they would retire to the pool rooms and play the races. And, when the races were over, they would then visit the faro banks and gamble until midnight or later. Later on they would proceed to another resort on Louisiana Street where Dodge really lived. Here his day may be said to have begun, and here he spent most of his money, frequently paying out as much as $50 a night for wine, and invariably ending in a beastly state of intoxication. It is quite probable that never in the history of debauchery has any one man ever been so indulged in excesses of every sort for the same period of time as Dodge was during the summer and fall of 1904. The fugitive never placed his foot on Mother Earth. If they were going only a block, Bracken called for a cab, and the two seemed to take a special delight in making Jesse, as Jerome's representative, spend as much money in cab hire as possible. The Houston Jews never again experienced so profitable a time as they did during Dodge's wet season, and the life of dissipation was continued until, from time to time, the prisoner became so weak from its effects that he was forced to go under the care of a physician. A few days of abstinence always restored his vitality, and he would then start out upon another round of pleasure. During this period Jesse maintained a close and vigilant personal espionage over the prisoner. For over 10 months he slept less than 4 hours each day, his fatigue being increased by the constant apprehension of treachery among his own men, and the necessity of being ever on the alert to prevent some move on the part of the defense to spirit the prisoner away. During the summer, attempts were repeatedly made to evade the vigilance of Jesse and his men, and several desperate dashes were frustrated by them, including one occasion when Bracken succeeded in rushing Dodge as far as Galveston, where they were forced to abandon their design. From time to time Bracken would disappear from Houston for a week or 10 days, stating on his return that he had been to New York, after which there was invariably some new move to get the prisoner away. Time and space prevent giving a detailed account of all the marches and counter-marches that took place in this battle of wit against wit. In August 1904, Bracken made one of his periodical visits to New York, and when he returned sought out Jesse and said, "Blocker, you might as well be a good fellow and get yours while you can. I mean that Dodge is not going back to New York, even if it cost $1 million to prevent it." A few days later, Bracken sent a gambler named Warner to Jesse, who offered the latter $3,500 to get lost long enough for the prisoner to slip over to Mexico. Acting upon the advice of his attorney, Jesse encouraged this attempt, under the belief that if he could get the Hummel forces in the position of having attempted to bribe him, the prisoner's bail could then be forfeited and Dodge himself taken into custody. Hummel became wary, however, and apparently abandoned for the time the idea of bribery. Later on, Bracken again disappeared. On his return, a marked change was noticeable in his demeanor, and Jesse observed that he was in constant consultation with Dodge, from which the detective drew the inference that some last desperate move was to be made towards the escape of the prisoner. On one occasion Jesse saw Bracken showing Dodge a map and some drawings on paper, which so excited his suspicions that he followed the two with unremitting assiduity, and within a day or two was rewarded through Bracken's carelessness with an opportunity for going through the latter's coat pockets in the billiard room. Here he found a complete set of plans worked out in every detail for spiriting the prisoner from San Antonio into Mexico during the state fair. These plans were very elaborate, every item having been planned out from the purchase of tickets, and passing of baggage through the customs, to hotel accommodation in the city of Mexico and Tampico, and steamship tickets from Tampico to Europe. The plan had been to secure permission from the court for Dodge to leave Houston long enough ostensibly to attend the fair at San Antonio and to lose him during the excitement and crowded condition of the city at that time. It is, of course, needless to say that these plans were abandoned when Bracken discovered that Jesse had been forewarned. Almost immediately thereafter, the Circuit Court of Appeals at Fort Worth, Texas, decided one of the habeas corpus cases adversely to Dodge, but it still permitted him to retain his liberty pending the final determination of the questions involved by the Supreme Court at Washington. The Hummel forces were apparently losing hope, however, for early in October, another attempt was made to bribe Jesse. Bracken entered his room one evening and informed him that he could get his own price if he would only be a good fellow, and even went so far as to exhibit a quantity of money which he stated was $25,000. The only result of this offer was to lead Jesse to redouble his precautions, for he argued that the situation must indeed be acute when such an offer could be deemed worthwhile. Thereafter it was obvious that the revelry of Dodge and his companions was on the increase. Accordingly, Jesse added to his force of assistants. On December 2, 1904, Nathaniel Cohen, another member of the firm of Howe and Hummel, arrived at Houston, and the next day the Supreme Court at Washington decided the appeal in the habeas corpus against the prisoner, who was at once ordered by Judge Burns into the custody of United States Marshal William M. Hanson. Things looked black indeed for Dodge and blacker still for Hummel. How the little attorney, eating his midday lunch 4,000 miles away, at Ponton's restaurant on Franklin Street, must have trembled in his patent leather boots. His last emissary, Cohen, at once procured an assistant by the name of Brookman, and with him proceeded to Wharton County, Texas, where they secured a new writ of habeas corpus and induced the local sheriff, one Rich, to swear in a posse comitatus of 100 men for the purpose of coming to Houston to take the prisoner by force of arms out of the hands of the United States Marshal. This was one of the most daring and desperate attempts made in recent years to frustrate the law. Jesse believes that the real object of this posse was to precipitate a fight between themselves and the federal authorities. It is not inconceivable that in such an event Dodge might either have escaped or been killed. The men composing the posse were of the most desperate character, and consisted largely of the so-called feud factions of Wharton County, known as the Woodpeckers and the Jaybirds. Jesse has been informed, on what he regards as reliable authority, that this move cost the Hummel forces $15,000 and that each member of the posse received $100 for his contemplated services in the rescue of the prisoner. But civil war, even on a small scale, cannot be indulged in without some inkling of the facts becoming known to the authorities, and prior to the receipt of the mandate of the Supreme Court, Judge Burns ordered the prisoner removed to Galveston for safe keeping. Thus the long, expensive, and arduous struggle came finally to an end, for Judge Burns in due course ordered that Charles F. Dodge should be conveyed to New York in the personal custody of the United States Marshal and delivered by him to the New York authorities within the borders of that state. Such an order was, of course, exceedingly unusual, if not almost unheard of, but it was rendered absolutely necessary by the powerful influence and resources, as well as the unscrupulous character, of those interested in securing Dodge's disappearance. In order to thwart any plans for releasing the prisoner by violence or otherwise, and to prevent delay through the invoking of legal technicalities, Hanson and Jesse decided to convey Dodge to New York by water, and on the 16th of December, the Marshal and his 5 deputies boarded a Mallory Line steamer at Galveston and arrived in New York with their prisoner on the evening of December 23d. Dodge reached New York a physical wreck. How he was induced to tell the whole truth after he had pleaded guilty to the charge against him is a story in itself. A complete reaction from his dissipation now occurred, and for days his life was despaired of. Jesse, too, was, as the expression is, all in, and the only persons who were still able to appreciate the delights of New York were the stalwart Marshal and his boys, who for some time were objects of interest as they strolled along Broadway and drank deep and hearty in the cafes. To the assistants in the district attorney's office they were heroes and were treated as such. How Dodge finally testified against Hummel on the witness stand has already been told. As they say downtown, if Jerome had never done anything else, he would have made good by locking up Abe Hummel. No one ever believed he would do it. But Jerome never would have locked up Hummel without Jesse. And, as Jesse says with a laugh, leaning back in his chair and taking a long pull on his cigar, I guess I would not do it again. No, I would not do it again for all the money you could give me. The wonder is that I came out of it alive. When the reader comes to think about it, he will probably agree with him.